I want to invite you to join us as we read from the book of Judges this morning. Today we'll be reading Judges chapter 9, verses 1 through 21. I'll read the passage and then finish by saying, "This is the word of the Lord," and you can respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." Judges chapter 9, verses 1 through 21. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem, to his mother's relatives, and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, "Say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh." And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, "He is our brother." And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. And he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the leaders of Shechem came together, and all Beth Milo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, "Listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you." The trees once went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, "Reign over us." But the olive tree said to them, "Shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored and go hold sway over the trees?" And the trees said to the fig tree, "You come reign over us." But the fig tree said to them, "Shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees?" And the trees said to the vine, "You come and reign over us." But the vine said to them, "Shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees?" Then all the trees said to the bramble, "You come and reign over us." And the bramble said to the trees, "If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon." Now therefore, if you acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his sons and his house, and have done to him as his deeds deserved, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you from the hand of Midian, and you have risen up against my father's house this day and have killed his sons, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the leaders of Shechem, because he is your relative. If you then have acted in good faith and integrity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Milo, and let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and from Beth Milo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and lived there because of Abimelech his brother. This is the word of the Lord.
Many a man proclaims his own steadfast love, but a faithful man who can find? That's Proverbs 26. And it's a provocative verse, right? Because the Bible is so painfully honest about the human heart. That we talk a good game, that we claim loyalty, that we believe we're faithful, but our human experience shows us this often isn't the case. What started with good intentions often gets undermined. You don't need a theology degree to see it. You don't need a philosophy degree. You just have to be working in an office or part of a family or give your heart to somebody, and you've probably experienced the pain of unfaithfulness. We live in a world of big promises and small follow-through. A world where people speak of devotion, but where betrayal, backbiting, even backstabbing can be so common. And even though we're separated from the time of Scripture by a few thousand years, there are certain things that have not changed. And number one, maybe on this earth, is the human heart. Humans are still capable of a high degree of betrayal. And maybe you yourself are guilty of that. Maybe you've betrayed somebody that you profess to love. Or maybe you've been on the receiving end of betrayal. Either way, there's hope in the gospel for you, and I hope you'll see that this morning. Judges 9 gives us a look at the human heart that is so honest and really so extreme. It's an extreme case of unfaithfulness, of betrayal, but it's a story that teaches us, I think, a lot about our own hearts, about how we should live, and ultimately about who God is. So we've been studying this story of Gideon over the last month or so. And if you haven't been with us, feel free to go back and to check out the sermons that we've already had in this story. But if you haven't heard those, don't worry. I think you can understand this passage really well, right? We saw that Gideon was this man who was scared. He was in hiding because the enemies of Israel were everywhere. And yet God comes and calls him to a higher purpose. He calls him to be this mighty warrior. And so Gideon, in response, he hesitates, he doubts, but ultimately he obeys. Again and again, he takes these steps of obedience to do what God has called him to do, and God gives him the victory. But after he's won the victory, he begins to act like a king. We see that he has multiple wives. At least we can assume that from the 70 sons that he has, right? That's probably more than one wife. He sets up his own religious practice that contradicts God's commands. And he even goes as far as to name one of his sons, the son of a concubine, names him Abimelech, which means my father is king. So Gideon's view of himself seems to be shifting, and he's trying to take more power for himself and maybe even set up his sons as rulers. And so after Gideon is gone, as we saw at the end of chapter 8, he died, there's this power vacuum. Who's going to now be in charge in Israel? Who's going to be the leader? And so Abimelech is the one who will step into that power vacuum and try to take control through betrayal. So he's the key character in the story. And remember, Abimelech, he's a son by a concubine, so he's not really one of the accepted sons of Gideon. He's sort of a second-class son. And so we're going to see that insecurity come out and how he tries to grab hold of power. So let's just look into the text here, and we'll see some of the setting here. We're going to see at the beginning a place, a people, and a plot that all play into this story really well. So look at the beginning of this passage. We see the place, which is so important. Look at verse 1 of Judges 9. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family. Okay, so stop right there. So we see that Abimelech goes to Shechem because that's where his mother is from. So he was raised in Shechem, most likely. This is his mom's side of the family. And he's going to try to get his mom's side of the family to go against his dad's side to gain control. Shechem is a very important city in biblical history. It's a place really of covenants and corruption. It's a place of renewal, but also of rebellion. There's a lot of events that happen in Shechem that are so important. So covenants are made in Shechem. In Genesis 12, we see when Abraham comes into the land, he makes that first covenant in Shechem. So it's a really important place just for that reason. And then in Joshua chapter 8, the people, when they come back into the promised land, they meet there and they renew this covenant, or they make this covenant. In fact, Shechem sits between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, these two mountains, one on the north, one on the south. And the town is in the middle in this valley. And it was on these mountains that when the people of Israel came into the promised land, God told them to stand on each of those mountains, half the people, half the tribes on one, half the tribes on the other, and to recite to each other the blessings and the curses from the Mosaic covenant. Meaning saying, blessed are you if you keep the covenant, right? And saying all the blessings and then responding with all of the curses. So it was a really significant area. And yet also, even though there was this covenant context, it was also a place of treachery. So early on in Israel's history, this place is associated with treason, with betrayal, because in Genesis 37, verse 12, Joseph is going and looking for his brothers, and he first goes to Shechem. And then it's after that they're going to betray him and sell him into slavery. Most important story, though, is in Genesis 34. A whole chapter is devoted to one of the most sordid, crazy stories in Israel's history, which is when a prince in the town of Shechem, whose name also happens to be Shechem, he sexually assaults Jacob's daughter, Dinah, and he wants to marry her in response. And so Jacob makes a deal with the leaders of Shechem and says, okay, you can have your son, the prince, marry my daughter. But then some of Jacob's sons come along and they say, well, hey, we should add a provision because they're not they're not Jewish like us, so we should add a provision that everyone gets circumcised. All the males are circumcised. So the town of Shechem agrees. No big deal. But after a couple days, a fever would hit after circumcision. And so while they're recovering and unable to fight, Simeon and Levi go in with their swords and they kill everyone. Kill all the men. You thought your family had issues, right? I mean, this is some bad stuff. And so they, just some genocide in Genesis 34. It's got a rough association. Betrayal in a really serious way. So, and later on we'll see it has the same kind of context. So Shechem carries a heavy history of both covenant and treachery, of renewal and rebellion, which makes it the perfect stage for this story, which is all about betrayal. So that's the place. And then we see the people. The people are, again, Abimelech's mother's relatives, so not his father's side. And he's trying to get them to basically go against his 70 brothers. And so his appeal to them is very simple. He says, wouldn't you rather have one of Gideon's sons rule over you rather than 70? Right? One king is better than a bunch of kings. So that's sort of a little bit of the setup. We're going to see the plot in a second. But I want us, as we go through this, to examine 4 questions this morning about betrayal. Four questions. The first question is, where does betrayal come from? What are the seeds that are planted? What leads someone to betray somebody else? Abimelech has asked this question. It's a simple question, right? Why not just have one king? And as we examine this, we can see how betrayal actually develops in a person's heart. What would lead somebody to turn against somebody else? We can see the appeal of treachery. First, we see that Abimelech, he affirms their identity. He says to them, right in verse 2, he says, remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. This is what Adam said about Eve when he first saw her, right? We're bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, we are the same. So he appeals to the similarities, and then they, in response, in verse 3, they decide to follow him, and what they say is, well, he is our brother. He's our relative. We share things in common. He may not be the best king, but because there's a relationship, they make him the king. And we often do this, right? We trust people because they are familiar, even if there's no evidence that they're faithful. We like people who look like us or have similar interests to us, similar background, maybe similar trauma even, negative things that have happened. And we can think that sameness is somehow correlated to goodness. But it's not always the case. And we often defend someone not because they're right, in their case is true, but because they're our person. They're on our side of the aisle. They're in our circle. So Abimelech resonates with their identity. He also offers them a sense of control. It's hard to trust in God who we can't see, even though he's the only source of stability in the world. And so what often people do is they choose a leader and they say, this is going to be the person that will give us stability. Maybe in Abimelech's case, it was because he was, a weaker person. They thought they might have control over him. So what we often do is we call on false kings. And very often false kings arise when we want order in our lives or in our countries. We want someone to fix, and so we give too much power. We have too much authority in our lives. The third thing we see about the root here of betrayal is that Abimelech promises them quick blessing. He promises them to deliver them in a sense. He can give them what they want and give it to them right now. And if you want to sum up kind of all bad choices in our lives, the worst decisions we make, that would be a good way to describe it. Getting what we want now at the low cost of sacrificing the future. Instant gratification is most often the path of long-term suffering. And the path of short-term pain is most often the path of long-term success. Abimelech can fix their problem. And then maybe the biggest reason why we would join with someone in betrayal, and I think it's the case for these men of Shechem, they like who he's against. They just have a common enemy. He's against the people that have probably a degree of control over them. Jerubbaal, or Gideon's sons, were probably influential people. And so they had a way to oppose their enemy. And how true this is in our own day, right? That we often like leaders or like certain people simply just because of who they'll criticize, who they're against. So we see here some of the seeds of betrayal. And betrayal can only lead to ugly things. So that's when we see the plot here in the story. There's a plot. Look at verse 4. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. So they gave him money from the temple of their false god. Shechem, later in the Bible, is going to be an Israelite city. It's not clear at what point it changes from a Canaanite city to an Israelite city, but it seems like at this point, at least in practice, they're acting like Canaanites. So it's possible this is a Canaanite city. But they've already engaged in worship of this false god, this Baal-berith, which is, that Baal just means Lord, and Berith means covenant. So ironically, right, Lord of the covenant, even as they're going to be breaking covenant and being unfaithful to each other. So they've already engaged in worship of this false god, and now they're taking money from the worship of that false god and using it as blood money to go and to murder 70 men. And here we have a key point, I think, which is that the person who will willingly betray another person has almost always already in their heart betrayed God. They've turned to worship something else, which entices them and justifies mistreatment of others. So he hires this gang that goes with him. We see they are worthless and reckless fellows, right? They're worthless, meaning they have no value, they have no purpose, and reckless, meaning they don't follow any social conventions. They'll kind of, you can't really control them. They'll do anything, right? They're mavericks. And verse 5 tells us that he murders all of his brothers, all 70 of them, on one stone. So this is a calculated assassination of all of them. And the idea could be that this is like some sort of ritual sacrifice. Killing all of these men on a sort of makeshift altar. There's a side note here that they missed one of the sons. That's the brother Jotham. So Jotham's able to get away. So now only two sons of Gideon are left, Abimelech and Jotham. Look at verse 6. It says, and all the leaders of Shechem came together and all Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. So this is the first time in the Bible that we see people choosing their own king. And every time this happens, it's going to be a really, really bad thing. Setting up someone that they say, we want to follow this person instead of God. So we see how betrayal begins in the desires of the heart. But second, we need to ask, how does this betrayal really take root? How does it grow? How does it take root? So Jotham, what he does is he responds by giving a fable. So he's able to get away, and then he stands on Mount Gerizim, where they would have read, the blessings and the curses of the covenant earlier in their history. And he stands up on this mountain, and he basically gives a curse in the form of a story, a fable. A fable it's a story where usually like animals talk in a fable. Sometimes it's plants. Here it's going to be plants, right? And a fable always has like a central lesson. So I'm sure we've all read Aesop's fables at some point in our lives. So he stands on the mountain, and he begins to tell this fable. And in this fable, it's the trees that are characters, and the trees are basically trying to find a king. And so the question for the trees is, well, who would be the best leader? So the first tree they go to is the tree that seems like it's the best because it's the most productive. They go to the olive tree. Look at verse 8. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us. So olive trees were so important in Israel because they provided many important things. But olives were one of those things, but really it was olive oil that was the key. So olive oil would be used for cooking, it'd be used for lighting lamps, it'd be used for even kind of medicinal purposes, worship in the temple. There's all kinds of uses for olive oil. And so having an olive tree was such an important resource. And so the olive tree, who produces this precious resource, when he's asked if he'll be the king, he responds in verse 9 by saying, shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored and go hold sway over the trees? I love, by the way, the pun, hold sway. I just think it's funny. But he's saying, I'm not going to go and rule because I have an important task to do. Next, they go to the fig tree in verse 10. And fig trees were also very important resources because, not just because of the fruit they produced, but because they didn't have sugar like we do. And so figs could provide a sweetener to different dishes. And so they ask him, will you be our king? In verse 11, the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees? So the fig tree also says no. Next, they go to the grapevine. And, of course, grapes are a source of wine, which was an important part of the Israelite diet. It was not only a drink used for celebration and for joy, but it was watered down and used as a everyday drink. And so the response from the vine is, verse 13, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees? So the olive tree represents fruitfulness and blessing. The fig tree is sweetness and nourishment. The vine is joy and provision. And none of them want to be king. Why? I think because people who are providing a benefit to society very often don't want to grab at power. Very often it's the productive that say, no, I have a real purpose, something I can focus on. I want to invest in this. And often it's those who produce and are beneficial to society that realize just how difficult it is to lead others. It's not an attractive thing. So what do the trees do? Well, as a last resort, they go to the bramble, to the thorn bush. In verse 14, then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. So what's a bramble bush? Like what is this? It's a thorny bush that's low to the ground. Okay, so it would often grow near other trees, kind of at the foot of different trees. It didn't provide any fruit, no material benefit. You really can't use the wood, if you could even call it that, of the tree for anything. And it was actually a liability. So it was a huge danger because it would be the easiest and the first thing to catch on fire, and then that fire could ignite whole trees, whole forests. So the plant is basically good for nothing except drawing blood if you were to touch it. In human terms, he'd be the person in every group project who doesn't do any of the work but wants to be the leader of the group, right? Or the guy who owns a $10,000 gaming setup but not a bed frame, right? That's why I don't want to hit too close to home for anybody here, but that friend who's always, right, taking from people, never giving to people, but always giving people advice of what they should do, that kind of a person. So a bramble is someone who doesn't contribute, doesn't protect, doesn't build, just consumes. And if things get hot, the bramble is the kind of person who's the first one to catch fire and spread chaos to everybody else. So how does the bramble respond? Predictably, by taking power. Verse 15, the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. So he says, come take refuge in my shade. I'll be your leader. Except he doesn't really offer any shade. That's not what this plant would give. And he says, I think it's fascinating, he says at the end of that sentence, he says, basically, either anoint me king, or if you want to go back on that, just know I will burn everything to the ground. You're not going to go back to normal, right? He doesn't offer protection. He doesn't offer shade. He doesn't offer anything productive, but he says, you don't get to return to your normal lives unless you're under my authority. And of course, once the bramble is even asked this question, nothing will ever go back to normal. So what is Jotham saying? Well, his fable is designed to show the people of Shechem that they have bought into a false promise, that they've trusted in someone who has no ability to deliver on his promises. And now they're going to be destroyed by the very person they trusted in. This is how betrayal works, right? Betrayal takes root because we believe increasingly the false promises that it offers. That if we engage in wickedness, that if we do something evil, that we can have something delivered to us. It offers shade that's an illusion. And so we see our third question here, how does betrayal spread? So once betrayal happens, once it's lodged in the heart and then it results in action, it always spreads to other people. Look at, this is verses 22 to 49. It's a long section. We're not going to go through this verse by verse or anywhere close to it. I'm going to sum up a lot of this. But up to this point, Abimelech's rise to power has been built entirely on his betrayal of his brothers. But in the next movement of the story, we see that betrayal doesn't stay there. It spreads, and it begins to backfire on Abimelech. This growth is at first invisible, and then we can see it, right? So look at verse 22. It says, Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years. That's interesting, right? 3 years of peace, of, a good reign. That seems like a success. But the reality with betrayal and with wickedness in general is that it works at first, but then it unravels. And slowly but surely, Abimelech's going to reap the results of the seeds that he's sown. Treachery can work in the short term, but never in the long term. And part of the reason is that anyone who has seen real treachery from people around them will never feel safe. It's just a matter of time before something divides and destroys. Nothing built on the sand of infidelity and hatred can stand. And the Bible is so often speaking to this reality because so often with evil, it looks like it's working. There are many psalms like this. Psalm 73 is one of those psalms that talks about this. This tension in the heart because you look around and you say, wicked people seem to be doing really well. They're prospering. Everything is easy for them. In fact, the psalmist begins to ask the question, have I been righteous in vain? Maybe I should go and join them because they have a better life than righteous people do. It's practically a universal experience if you're trying to do the right thing, that you'll see people around you who don't care about integrity and yet are benefiting from that. But we have to be careful. We can't believe that lie that evil people will actually prosper in the long run. As much as wickedness and treachery looks good in the moment or benefits people in the moment, there is an invisible timer that is counting down to self-destruction. As much as the person who does the immoral thing might be able to advance in your company, it won't last. Or as much as the person in your school who compromises their morals might get praise from others, that praise is not valuable and it won't last. Nothing built on wickedness will stand. So we see that there's a temporary benefit to this kind of evil. And then we also see that God uses ordinary means to unravel betrayal. Verse 23 is a pretty shocking verse that we could talk about for a while, but look at verse 23. So after it says Abimelech ruled for 3 years, it said, and God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, and the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech, that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come and their blood be laid on Abimelech, their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. So it says here, God sent an evil spirit, a demon we would call that. And he does that to undermine the relationship between the traitors, between the men of Shechem and Abimelech. He drives a wedge between them. So what do we make of this? God sending an evil spirit. We don't have time to untangle all the complexities theologically, but we can just land on a few simple things, which is one, God is sovereign. He's in control of everything. He's even in control of evil. So no evil action happens outside of God's perfect control and his perfect plan. Which means, second, that even though God never authors evil, even though he hates evil because it's against his very character, he's so strong that he can turn evil around. He can use it for the opposite purpose that it was intended for. That's how much power and control and wisdom God has. So he sends an evil spirit, the evil spirit looking to do harm, God through that looking to work his judgment. But sending an evil spirit doesn't really seem like an ordinary or normal thing. And maybe that's because I think we often misunderstand or kind of sensationalize what demonic activity actually looks like. Evil spirits work through ordinary, kind of boring temptations in our lives. They don't usually look like how Hollywood movies portray them. They work surreptitiously behind the scenes in subtle ways. The battle is actually almost always about ordinary choices that we make. Small temptations. So this demon comes in. We don't see him actively working, but we know that behind the scenes he is. And what happens is really people begin to get stirred up to go into further betrayal of each other. Betrayal is inherently self-destructive, and so God judges it really by just letting it naturally work its course. And so we see in verse 26, a new character is introduced named Gal. Gal is described as the son of Ebed. That's just the word for slave in Hebrew, so it may just be Gal, the son of a slave. And he comes into town, and the people quickly put their confidence in him. They begin to be attracted to him and see him as a person to solve their problems. So after betraying Gideon's sons and doing that with Abimelech, the Shechemites begin to undermine Abimelech as well. And so in verses 28 and 29, basically what happens is they're at a drinking party, so Gal and the men of Shechem, and he just begins to trash Abimelech. He's mocking him, and then he says, effectively, if I were king, if I were in charge, I'd get rid of Abimelech. And so the men are once again drawn into that betrayal. And this is what betrayal does. It begins to reshape the way a community functions. There's an addictive aspect to it, right? If you betray someone once, you'll often betray them again. If you pick a really bad leader, you often will do that again and again. And for Abimelech, most people don't realize it, right, when they're engaged in betrayal and rebellion, but one of the worst things for a rebel is that he would actually succeed in his rebellion. Because then, he often, when a rebel becomes a ruler, very often he's now on the receiving end of the same behavior that he was dishing out before. So Abimelech responds in verses 30 to 45. What happens is he uses deception and sets up an ambush for Gal. He defeats him, and he burns the city of Shechem to the ground, and he sows it with salt, which is a way of basically saying this is never going to bear fruit again. It's like complete, total war, total destruction. At every layer, betrayal breeds further betrayal. Every act of treachery invites a new one. And the downward spiral continues faster and faster. So the text here is showing us the multiplying power of unfaithfulness. Once betrayal gets loose, it spreads quickly and always further than we intended. Like brambles, it grows aggressively, filling the relational space and causing harm to others. Then we see one last question here, the fourth question, which is, where does betrayal lead? Where does betrayal lead? What's the fruit of betrayal? We see this in the very last section of the chapter. The final fruit of betrayal is destruction. Right? These kings are crushed by their own evil. Gal receives that backlash first. He's destroyed first, but so is Abimelech. So Abimelech, after he's won this victory, he then, for some unknown reason, goes on to the next city. So we don't really have a description of why that happens, but he goes to the next city, which kind of looks like the word Thebes in your Bibles in verse 50. That's not how it's pronounced. And as they begin to burn this city down with fire, the same way they did with Shechem, a woman throws an upper millstone out of the window. So apparently this woman's been doing like major deadlifts, right? I mean, that's a very heavy weight. I don't know if she had help, but throws a stone. It hits Abimelech. And as Abimelech is dying, he asks his armor bearer to thrust him through with a sword, to kill him, so that it won't be said of him in the future that he was killed by a woman. He doesn't want that disgrace. So this is justice. It's hand-delivered by God. Listen to how the chapter ends. The author doesn't want us to be unclear that even though God seems to be absent from this chapter entirely, God is working. Look at verse 56. It says, "Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their own heads. And upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal." The men who trust in Abimelech get exactly what they had coming to them. They reap what they've sown. And there's a warning in this that we cannot miss. Because so often in our hearts, we are being tempted toward betrayal. And usually it looks so innocent at first, these small things. Maybe you're tempted to speak badly of a coworker or harm a coworker because it could allow you to be elevated in your workplace. Or maybe you're tempted with a friend of yours to engage in gossip, to hear something you shouldn't hear, or to say something that you know is not quite true. Or maybe you're enticed toward infidelity in your marriage, one of the worst kinds of betrayals. Or maybe you're simply just feeling the pull that all of us as sinful people do toward betraying God. Every sin is a betrayal of God. Evil can only deliver on its promises for a moment, followed by an eternity of destruction. We have to remember that. Just how fleeting the shadows of the blessings of betrayal actually are. They don't lead anywhere good. Abimelech's story ends with evil collapsing in on itself. Abimelech lights a fire to destroy someone else, but he gets burned. Proverbs 26:27 says, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling." If you try to entrap someone else with evil motives, it'll hurt you. And Abimelech metaphorically started that stone rolling, hoping to push it on to others, and it ended up literally falling on him. He slaughtered his brothers on a single stone, and then he had a stone dropped on his head. That's poetic justice. And Abimelech's story ends with disgrace, right? He says, "I don't want to be known as the guy who got killed by a woman." The only mention of him in the rest of the Bible, of this Abimelech, is in 2 Samuel 11:21. And guess how he's referred to? The man who was killed by a woman. There's actually a word for this idea that evil destroys itself. It eats itself from the inside. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, he called it eucatastrophe. EU catastrophe, right? So that EU prefix is the word good. So a good catastrophe. The idea that when evil looks like it's about to win, when evil is most ascendant, most triumphant, that it suddenly destroys itself and something good breaks through. One of my favorite examples of this is in Harry Potter. When Voldemort kills Harry Potter, spoiler, the worst thing that could happen in the story, right? The worst thing that could happen is the hero dies, and yet it's in that moment that unwittingly he's destroying himself. The catastrophe becomes the means of evil undoing itself. The defeat becomes the victory. That's what happened here with Abimelech. His own violence lands on his head. And the greatest catastrophe in history is found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. The story of God is a story of a great betrayal. God creates humanity and gives them everything, and humans reject him. Later in the Bible, the Israelites who are delivered by God, their king, are going to demand a king like the nations. And we do it all the time. We turn away from God, our king, and we make ourselves the kings in our lives. And of course, the greatest reversal of evil was through the greatest betrayal ever. When God, in human flesh, right, was betrayed by his closest friend, betrayed with a kiss. And as a result, God went to his death. And the cross looked like the triumph of evil. It looked like the betrayers had won the day. The Son of God handed over to death, the powers of darkness rejoicing, the worst catastrophe in human history. But God was doing something that none of us could imagine. He was destroying evil. He was destroying death. The crucifixion broke into the victory of the resurrection. And the worst evil in history somehow enabled the greatest good in history. And every week when we take communion, we hear the same words. And there's one specific word that to me has stood out so many times. It seems out of place, right, if you don't understand that story, if you don't understand how all of this works. And that's the word we say every week. It's the word betrayed. The Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. Why is that there? It's to remind us of exactly how God works, right? There's more in this story in Judges 9 than just a warning to those who would engage in betrayal. There's a comfort here for those who have been betrayed. God says to every wounded heart, I redeem betrayal. Only God can turn a story around like that. And if you belong to Jesus, then it's the guarantee that one day God will take whatever it is you've experienced, whatever terrible things you've gone through, he will redeem them. This is the pattern of all of history. This is the banner that's waving over God's people through all of time. God redeems his people. And God says to every person who has engaged in betrayal, there's hope for you too. There's forgiveness. There's freedom. If you've done something anywhere close to this, right, you can't go back and fix that. You can't undo that betrayal that you've had in someone else's life, the ways that you've harmed or divided. And while we can't fix those things that we've done, God can. In his sovereign plan, he can find a way to fix it. To first of all, to wash us, to forgive us, to give us a new identity. But then in time, he can show us how even the evil actions that we've done somehow, in God's wisdom, are fulfilling his perfect plan. So we started by asking the question, right? A faithful man, who can find? Who can find a faithful man? We can. His name is Jesus. The only perfect one, the only faithful one. And because he was betrayed, you can be healed and restored from whatever betrayal you've gone through. And because he was faithful unto death, he can make you faithful. Can give you a new name, call you his child, and empower you toward obedience in him. Let's pray together.